Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Specifying Practice Group webinar. Our topic for today is Manufacturer Specs, Opportunities, and Pitfalls. Our thought leaders are David Stutzman and Louis Metcalf. Dave is a registered architect, certified construction specifier, and founding principal of Conspectus, a specifications and quality assurance consulting firm. Louis is an architect and certified construction specifier. Louis manages the specifications and quality assurance programs for Gresham Smith & Partners, a national architecture, engineering, interiors, and planning firm. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Your participation during today's webinar is encouraged, and we have allowed time to take questions throughout the presentation. Although attendee audio lines are muted, you may click the raise hand button to indicate that you have a question or comment. We will identify you by name and unmute your line, at which point you may begin speaking. If you are participating via streaming audio and do not have a computer microphone, you may also type your question into the chat box. Now, Dave and Louis, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Louis speaking to you from sunny Nashville, Tennessee, and Dave is over in New Jersey. And as a special treat today, because of the subject, we invited our friend Phil Kebza from North Carolina to join us. Phil is a director of technical services at his firm, Spec Guy. He's an independent specifications consultant, and specifically he does a lot of manufacturer guide specs. So if you want to get mad at somebody, he's somebody that you can maybe blame. I'm really looking forward to the presentation this afternoon. I think we have some ideas. We're going to try to talk about manufacturer specs are such a good resource, but they often need extensive reworking to be usable for our purposes. And so what we're going to try to do is kick around some ideas and try to present some practical suggestions on what to look for and how to use manufacturer specs. And one of the reasons I'm especially looking forward to this presentation is that Dave and Phil were both snowed under with work this week, so I put together the outline and I did the assignments. So both of them are going on first, and if they run out of time, then you won't have to listen to me make up stuff at the end of the program. So we'll begin with, let's look at the first slide. And
let's get back and get organized here. Holy cow.
What are you doing, David?
I don't know.
Press the right button. There you go. And Dave's going to talk to you about why manufacturer specs seem to be so different.
Okay. Yeah, I love technology. This is great. Thanks, Louis. Despite technology, you still have to have the person to be able to push the right button. So, manufacturer specs. We want to look at them because I'm sure that you've all seen your own fair share of manufacturer specs and the various purposes for which they're used. So we see, I have written some manufacturer specs myself, so I have some insight that way, but we're going to rely on Phil a lot today to be able to fill in from the manufacturer's standpoint. So from a specifier, independent specifier standpoint, we see manufacturer specs and what's included them as a manufacturer's way of actually trying to get the product specified. And oftentimes, they're also using the specs as a way to sell products, sometimes by cross-pollinating among the specs where they may not be the exact same kind of a product, but it might be a related product or a related product line that gets mentioned in multiple specifications to pique the curiosity of those folks using the spec to go look at something else. Also see them using them to limit liability as far as where the manufacturer starts and stops his work, and to limit competition. One of my biggest objections to manufacturer specs, and even those that I try to write, we encourage the manufacturers that this is the perfect time for you to actually name your competition. Name those folks that you really want to go up against, rather than allowing the architects and designers to choose those that you have to go up against once the construction spec is issued.
How about that last item, David?
The last item, I thought I covered that, Louis.
I was going to comment on that last item.
You were? Well, then I'll
Okay,
go back.
Go back.
So let's
All
jump back
right,
there
here
a
you
second.
go.
Because that's
because-
an interesting challenge for the specifier trying to use a manufacturer's specification. Well, frequently, you know, they know their product better than we do. They make it, but they may not understand the specification as a work result. It is not just about products in Part 2. It's about how it relates to some related products that may need to be specified in the section, but because the manufacturer doesn't make those other products, they just get left out of the picture. So that's a challenge to the specifier using the manufacturer's spec, is to make sure that it gives you a complete work result.
The other thing I was thinking about on that item is that they often try to write a subcontract scope, kind of, I don't know, for the benefit of their installers who may be factory authorized or certified guys or gals, and so they try to limit what's in the spec section and what isn't, and sometimes we may want to add some things that the manufacturer would just as soon was in a different section. Before we go on to the next item, we have a couple poll questions, and Rob, would you please put up the first one? And we'll give you a minute. How often do you use manufacturer guide specs? We kind of need to get a little feel for, presumably, there's about 47 of you out there that have some interest in this subject, so if you'll answer those, and we'll take a quick straw vote.
Well, looks like we've got an overwhelming majority that are using them at least occasionally, and just a few that are using them never.
Okay. Well, that's kind of what we expected. Rob, let's go ahead and do the second poll question too, please. And the second question is, what is your primary use for manufacturer guide specs? Are we just using it as a basis for starting from scratch? Do we actually try to edit them, cut them down to size, or again, not using them at all? And the numbers are coming in.
Well, again, it's looking like we got the good majority saying as information.
That's interesting. And yeah, and about twice as many are using it as a basis for writing a section from scratch as are using it for editing. Let's put those figures up there. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I'm curious if we ask that question to, say, a live group of participants in an AIA small project practitioners group instead of a CSI specifiers group, how those numbers might play out. Because I think, you know, one of the things that number there expresses is we have people who can digest information and translate it, participating today. And the manufacturer's specification appears to be serving a pretty, you know, an increasing role amongst people who don't have the specification writing and editing skill set.
All right, let's go on to our next point. Let's talk about format issues, and Phil is going to discuss this topic with you.
Well, this is one of the wrestling points for many manufacturers who don't live in our specification world, and who, when we talk about master format number and title, all you have to do is go look at any of the information aggregator sites, such as Suites or ARCAT, where manufacturers are given pretty free rein in how they classify their specification documents and, you know, and where they put them. And what you find right away is they use kind of a scattershot approach, and you start reading their specification, you realize it doesn't necessarily include what it was that the number and title that they used suggests. So they don't necessarily play strictly with master format. With section form, of course, there may be some editing there for you to do in order to be able to make their materials work within your project. Similar kinds of issues with section format, of course. And that's also a way to read the age of a guide specification, because there are only a few out there that have digested section format 2008. So if you are trying to establish some uniformity across your project manual, that'll be a challenge with a manufacturer's spec, because they're just not likely to be organized in the way that you're organizing some of the specifications you're generating yourself. And thirdly, with page format, you're going to be all over the map. If you use commercially produced master specification systems such as master spec or spec text, or generating specifications out of spec link, you are ending up with styled documents using a word processing style as a background for organizing the format, and you will seldom see that in manufacturers' specifications. So the formatting automation software that you like to use on the rest of your documents are not going to be running on those documents unless you do a significant amount of hand formatting of them. And if you have time to do that, you have time to write that section from scratch.
Or maybe you have way too much time.
That could be, and I hope that's not the case.
Okay. Hey, Phil, I have a question for you on the master format number and title. The way that you were talking about that, it sounds like perhaps the manufacturers are using the numbers and titling to sort of position their product in the marketplace. Do you find that to be true?
There's some of that goes on if the manufacturer is master format savvy. But what I see with a lot of misclassified documents is they just don't know better. They're not expert in that. So I would say it's a mix.
Okay.
Before we go on to the next point, let's Rob, would you please put up the poll question number 3?
Pardon me. We also had some comments.
Okay.
Oh, that's great.
Read those up while the poll.
Let's take the comments while people are voting.
Sure. Justin Kerfoot writes in. He says, "Seems to me that manufacturers would also want to list their competitors so that there's fair, comparable products being bid and used versus a product that might not actually be apples to apples." And that's based on his experience.
Well, we certainly agree with that concept, but not all the manufacturers are that hip, basically. A lot of them are really afraid of that, but I don't know why. Because one of the complaints we get from time to time from distributors in particular, not so much subcontractors, but product distributors and product reps, is that there is maybe a product in our spec that is not really comparable and it's lower priced. And guess what's going to get put on the job? Okay, how are we stacking up here?
Well, we've got an overwhelming majority, more than any others, of the previous questions that say we always have to do major editing or rewriting.
No surprise there.
Right.
And, we think that's a healthy sign, actually. All right.
Were there other questions? Well, Rob, were there other questions, or was that the only one?
There was one other. I'm sorry. Wade Bevier writes in. He was asking, are you aware of the beta program being developed by staff for evaluating the manufacturer specs for formatting protocols to align with CSI formatting guidelines?
Yes. because some of that program was run through the technical committee, so I am aware of it, and I know that it's currently going on sort of as a test program, depending upon, and my understanding is that it's been pretty successful with the manufacturers that have participated so far. And if it does continue to be successful, then I guess they'll roll it out to the general population. And I have to apologize for all this technical garbage showing up on the screen. I'm sorry about that. And I thought I had Microsoft Office and Outlook shut down, but apparently it's working somehow in the background.
Okay, some general considerations when working with a manufacturer's guide spec. Of course, the manufacturers sometimes do not have a very good feel for what's in Division 1, and so you're going to have to especially look at those kinds of issues so that you don't contradict what is in the other parts of the construction documents and even the conditions for the contract. One of the things that I always look for in manufacturer specs and hope to find are some notes to help you make decisions. What kinds of decisions do I need to make? What options are there available that I need to pick from? Next, we need to think about, does the manufacturer's guide spec use a terminology that is also suitable for drawing notes? Because, of course, that's a key concept. We don't want to call things one thing in the specs and something else on the drawings, because that's a sure recipe for unnecessary RFIs. And then this last item is something that Phil has already sort of mentioned, talked about, is the manufacturer's guide spec talking about the product like a standalone item, like buying a car or buying a stereo set or a new TV or something, or is it really talking of, do they understand that this product, whatever it is, has to be fitted into improvements to real property, that it's part of a general construction contract? All right. Now, as all good specifiers know, we should, when we're going to write a spec or edit a spec, it's wisest to start with Part 2. And before we let Phil get started on Part 2 products, let's have our final poll question, Rob. Please put up number 4. When you use manufacturer guide specs, how often do you add competing products to the section? I suspect we'll be able to predict the outcome to that pretty well, but let's get those voting in.
Yes.
Okay, this is overwhelmingly. Only
Phil,
occasionally.
Phil, I'd like to hear your opinion on this. When you're working with manufacturers writing their specifications, are you getting the same resistance to adding competitors?
Yes, and despite the fact that I pass on to our clients a little mini white paper that we keep on our website, which addresses just that issue, David, that you have raised continuously as we've talked about this presentation. They're going to be added, obviously. We can go to our clients and say, look, 73% of these specifiers say they're adding other manufacturers. Why don't you keep some control of that and add them yourselves? A few do. The question is, the closer the guide spec is to the representatives in the field, the more realistic it is.
Of course, on the other hand, Phil, a manufacturer may be just a little bit hesitant to mention specific model names and numbers, which could change the day after the thing is published, and they don't want to take responsibility for sending you to in the wrong direction. So that is the kind of the balancing truth on that question.
We suggest, and actually, when we jump into this a little further, I'll touch on that.
Okay.
And what a solution for that might be. But course, we're not here today to counsel manufacturers so much as we are to talk about these opportunities and pitfalls from the specifier's point of view.
Okay, well, let's get going with the next slide.
Whoa, wait a minute. What was that?
Oops. Oh, we have to go back.
What was that? Oh, for any of you that don't know Phil, there he is.
Don't know the spec guy. There he is.
Yeah, I know. That's what he does, is sit around when he doesn't have anything else to do.
An ebullient person.
Boy, now, if we can spell that, okay. Before we get started on part 2, or, as we're kind of planning our strategy for part 2, there's some basic questions that need to be asked about, just what are we putting there? What is it? How does it function as a component of a work result? Are we making something on the job site out of basic materials, or are we describing materials that are then factory fabricated into a component or group of components, or an assembly perhaps, because we need to know how to outline part 2. And we want to have some sense of where we're going. Is it going to be the traditional materials, fabrication and finish, or very likely it's going to be more complicated than that? And this is an area where manufacturers struggle with this. I mean, those are the decisions, if you as a specifier are scratch writing a spec, that you have to look at that and you start writing your part 2, and then you realize, I need to kind of change my outline around here because I'm not, this isn't clear as where I'm going. So you can expect to see some awkwardness in manufacturers' guide specs sometimes as far as how that is organized. So we try to help them organize their part 2 so that we group information by decision, and you can eliminate either full articles or full groups of paragraphs and subparagraphs, based upon which of their products are being used in what way. But this, these 8 or 9 bullet points here are a question that we need to ask whenever we're dealing with part 2.
Okay.
And I have a couple of quick questions, if you don't mind.
Good.
Oh, all right. Sandy McClellan writes in, she's wondering, will we be touching on the master spec manufacturer guide specs paid for by the manufacturers?
I think we've got a lot to cover here with going off into a specific proprietary type of guide spec, but I think some of the points that we're making here apply to the master specs, what's called product master spec library, or any other source of guide specifications that you're trying to evaluate.
Okay, and then one more, and this is from Stephen Groff. He asked, do you have any tips for how to guard against a manufacturer's guide spec that appears open but is really proprietary?
Oh, we're going to
discover and weed out proprietary requirements.
Phil's going to go all over that.
Oh yeah. I have my favorite methods, and I hope some of the rest of you have some suggestions too.
Okay,
so jumping in, very typical to a manufacturer's specification, you're going to find a manufacturer's statement at the beginning of Part 2 with clear information on how you can get a hold of them, their 24-hour hotline and, everything else, because, of course, they want the call from you and from the contractor. The real question in any Part 2, including a manufacturer guide spec Part 2, is how free is the contractor to shop in this work result? And you as a specifier need to decide that and control it to the extent that you can out there in the Wild West. And so is this a closed specification and you will only be approving whatever is listed here, or is it a kind of loose basis of design where you may be allowing or even inviting either comparable product submittals or substitution requests, that question has to be coordinated with your Division 1 and with your bidding documents as well, so that it gets clear to people, you know, what they can and can't do. And that's the subject of quite a bit of study.
Especially if your project is a publicly funded job, many times the substitution restrictions in a manufacturer's guide specifications just won't fly for a publicly funded project.
That's right.
Yeah, one of the things that we run into too is if you don't know the product yourself as you're specifying, there can be little hidden things in the spec that tend to make it proprietary. One of the minimum sizes or minimum gauges of material can often trigger that, because the manufacturer that provided the spec knows that his is the only one that'll meet it, and sometimes those are difficult to check.
I believe that's in the next slide. Dave, why don't you bring that up?
Ah, all right.
I think that's one of the biggest questions on people's minds, and quite frankly, the only way I have found to, well, there's two ways to discover if there are what are called in the trade hidden lockouts. And very sales-oriented manufacturer groups tend to use those. They're very proud of the lockouts that they try to write in. They think they're very clever. And I usually give our clients a lecture on what happens at a school board meeting when there's a bid protest and the architect is standing there with egg all over his face because the spec that he issued was actually a closed proprietary spec and he didn't know it. That often is an opportunity to get them to understand how important a question that is from the standpoint of the design professional. But so, you know, one
and
way
could
of
affect the design professional's decision to specify that manufacturer on future jobs.
It could have a very big effect on that, and it does.
I got burned that way a couple of times, and boy, those guys were out of my specs for a long time.
We hold grudges, don't we? We do. I'm honest with them about that. Look, I need to know who your honorable competition are, because they're going into the spec, or else maybe somebody else is. Another thing is once the spec is done, but before you send it out, flip a copy over to a rep from a competing product and have them comment on it. And I'll tell you, they know all of their competitors' lockouts. They all know them, and you'll discover them in a hurry. You'll learn, for instance, that if you have your friendly local hardware guy write a specification and it looks real open except when you get down to the minutia under the closers, and they're insisting on a cast iron cylinder for the closer, that's one of the best known lockouts in the industry. But that comes in time, and you can't learn all those things in 1 or 2 or 5 years. But if you don't have to know everything, you just have to know who to ask.
That's right.
Send it to their competition. What else do we have?
And that's why you should all belong to CSI and attend all the meetings.
Absolutely. That's where you get that support.
It's, you know who to call. Manufacturers usually get carried away in describing their products, and they're going to include data that really doesn't matter to you on your project. They may cite an ASTM standard that their product complies with, which actually addresses all of the various details that they then proceed to list anyway. So unfortunately, you're actually going to have to know some of your key ASTM standards, and that's the bad news. But you do, otherwise you have a messy spec. And depending on who touched it last, the technical department or the marketing department, there could be a lot of fuzzy language with things like heavy duty or heavy gauge metal, and you know, which of course we have no clue what that means.
Yeah, all those undefined, vague terms.
That's right. There are also sometimes installation-related data that get dragged into manufacturer's guide specs. you really may not care how many lineal feet of mod bit roofing is on a roll. I don't know why you would, but it could be there.
One of my complaints is that a lot of manufacturers don't clearly show what product options need to be selected, and they certainly don't do it in a kind of a logical sequence.
Very true. They don't, and you know, one of the greatest resources, you know, we should be talking about opportunities as well as the pitfalls here. One of the greatest potential resources in a manufacturer's guide spec are the specifier's notes. They should really be located at decision points, and they should explain to the specifier, here's where you use this product, and here's where you use this one which is slightly different, but it's for high temperature conditions, or it's for circumstances where you have to apply this to green concrete or whatever it might be. You know, we need to have our hand held some. We just can't know everything.
Let's go on to performance criteria.
Okay.
Right.
I think I had a little side document there.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Good.
I just went past it too. I'm sorry. We'll go back.
Right. Well,
We'll go back. There you go.
We can get back to it. And I chose this not to beat up on these folks because this is maybe a better than average manufacturer's spec. But anybody who's read the PRM knows what. The dimensions go on the drawings, and qualities, you know, the qualities go on in the specification. And if you picture a specifier going through and picking out the particular thickness of these engineered wood members, the first question that comes to mind is, why are we naming this here when we know the structural engineer has to put that on the drawing? And secondly, you may have a half a dozen locations where you're using them, and you're using different thicknesses and different depths in each of them. So they don't belong in the specification, and I suggest that the stuff that I highlighted in gray here shouldn't be there to begin with. A guide spec is not a product data sheet, and it's not a catalog page. It's the precursor of a contract document. So it does certain things, and there's some things it really doesn't have to do, and we can make it a little simpler here.
I see we have a hand up. Rob, you want to
Absolutely.
recognize Mr. O'Barron?
Yep. Kevin, you should be unmuted now.
Hello. My question was, it always comes down to when you're talking about a proprietary spec where you name manufacturers and models, sometimes what's in the manufacturer's suggested spec isn't even accurate to their own product. Their resources aren't always, keeping their own literature up to date. So I guess I'm talking typically on my jobs where I've got pieces of major equipment. I often tend to send that draft spec out to each one of the manufacturers named in it sometime prior to the advertisement for bids, with a request that they comment on it. And I just wanted to get some thoughts on the propriety of that. I mean, there's a very practical reason for doing it, but is it also somewhat, letting the cat out of the bag prior to the pricing phase?
Kevin, why don't you tell us what kind of equipment you're talking about? Are you talking about mechanical equipment?
Yeah, I'm an environmental engineer, so most of the stuff I'm talking about is going to be
excellent.
Mechanical type equipment.
Good question.
Yeah, great question, and
we're expecting a great answer from you.
Here it comes. Yeah, the longer I've done this, the more inclined I am to do just that, Kevin. I recently completed a master's specification library for a school district, and I went out of my way to send as many of those around to as many of the representatives as I could. I'd much rather have their comments now while I can still perfect the spec than, get their comments when it goes out on the street and find out that it's not right. Especially on a public project like that, it's public information and public knowledge. So why not go ahead and send it out? It's a really good practice. It's somewhat time-consuming, but the time you spend might be a lot less than the time you would spend trying to, perfect the documents during addenda because you get, one of those phone calls you don't like.
Sure, and you know, it's also partly an embarrassment if you have a overly long addendum. It doesn't really serve anybody well. But I had a situation fairly recently where I'm kind of a internal manager for one of our clients, and one of the project managers, other than myself, working for that client, was getting manufacturer comments on a spec, and he wound up sending out, you know, all of the front end with it too, because he thought he was concerned they might be trying to force some limitation to liability or something. And I kind of barked a little bit about that and said, you know, getting comments on the spec is one thing, but letting half of the bidding documents out in advance, that's really not fair to other folks that aren't named in the spec but might be trying for an R equal. So,
all right.
Yeah, you know, I agree with you that you do have to be careful, and depending on the method of specifying, if you're using basis of design where you really are only describing the characteristics of one product, but you're listing two other manufacturers who you have pretty high confidence can meet that spec, you do have to be very careful about not creating any appearance of favoring one bidder over another. Bid protests, public bid protests can be pretty ugly things to go through. You don't want to trigger them.
Right. They can involve a huge amount of time on everybody's part, and especially if it ends up resulting in a rebid.
Yeah, clients really don't like it when that happens, and the overall project schedule is delayed, and if you want repeat work, that's not the way to get it.
And there does seem to be sort of a move on in some states, at least that I'm aware of, New Jersey, North Carolina, to name a couple, that to sort of discourage any kind of proprietary spec and just have you know, no manufacturer names in them at all.
Yeah, that's difficult.
That's
difficult to do, of course, and requires a whole lot more homework. But we kind of need to get back to our subject, and before we get back to the next item, I want to say that we're now about 18 minutes until the hour, and it's apparent that this is an important subject and needs a lot more discussion than we're going to be able to do in an hour. And so we don't want to rush through this, and we do want to encourage questions and participation, as we've already had. So you just keep the questions and answers rolling in, and we will finish this session in our meeting next month, if
we need to, yes, absolutely.
And I think we're going to. So,
okay. Well,
back to you, Phil. Take it away.
I'll jump ahead here.
No, don't jump ahead. Take your time. Do it right.
Okay. By the way, the term performance specification is wildly misunderstood throughout the industry, especially in the world of the manufacturer. They think of a performance specification as any specification other than a named product. So they don't really understand, you know, what the difference between that and a descriptive specification or a reference standard specification. So just so you know that you sometimes you're speaking with two different sets of terminology in folks' heads. And so you're going to find information which is good information, but it's wrongly categorized. You're also going to find test reports that may be current and applicable, may not be. The state of manufacturers' test reports is all over the map. There are some that run very tight ISO 9000 type programs and maintain very current testing and implant QA/QC and that kind of thing. And there are others who had some obscure testing agency do their testing back in 1989, haven't updated it since, and actually it's been copied several times in marketing, and the information is, number one, clerically incorrect, number two, the metrics are wrong, etc. I mean, there's great opportunity for errors in manufacturers' data, and so you should really look at more than one product's data just to see whether something looks like it's out of line.
Phil,
and
when you're when you're writing the specs, or when you're writing both product manufacturer specs and project specs, are you asking for that current available test data and checking to make sure that it is stating what manufacturer sales literature is actually saying also?
When I'm working with the manufacturer, I absolutely want to see the test reports. When I'm working on a project specification, it comes up sometimes, but not so often. We utilize a commercial master system as a basis for what we take off from. So unless we're custom writing a section, which again, usually you've got a couple of those per job. Unless we're writing a custom, we'll rely on the information that was published nationally in a commercial master, in part because it's a very time-consuming thing.
Right.
Sometimes to even get a hold of that. But our test properly selected. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to suggest to Rob that we have a number of questions that I see that we haven't tried to address yet. And we have about 15 minutes left in the hour, and perhaps we should try to catch up to those questions if we're going to continue this into next month.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll start at the top here. The first was a comment from Jonathan Miller. He writes, Guide Spec Part 2 substitution line should use CSI's Substitution Request Form 1.5C during the bidding phase, or Form 13.1A after the bidding phase. Just a comment there.
Actually, I'm pleased to note, Jonathan, that Master Spec Division 1, which we've been involved with for some years, cites those forms in the Substitution Procedures section. So we don't cite them in the individual sections that we write.
And the problem is that many manufacturer guide specs will put substitution procedures or requirements in there that are quite different from what you have in your standard Division 1 front-end stuff.
And they don't do it right either.
Yeah, that too.
We try to just make the generic statement that sends the bidder back to the instruction
back to Division 1,
and the contractor back to Division 1.
That's right. Next question.
Yep, the next is from Lauren Connors, and she writes, as a manufacturer's rep who frequently provides custom material for low budget projects, we do not have competition that can provide those materials. Do specifiers and architects recommend that we be completely upfront about the fact that the spec is closed and proprietary, and or ask the specifier how we can work through to add the alternates? Not
I would say a resounding yes. You do be upfront, because especially think of if we're writing a specification for a school or some other publicly funded project, there are some materials where we can get away with writing a closed spec, but we have to be very careful, and they have to be very limited. And generally, it's best for us, if we have to do something like that, to discuss it up front with our clients to make sure that it's acceptable to them.
Oftentimes there's an administrative process that goes along with that, where each individual product that's proprietary has to be individually approved by the agency that's actually funding the project. So upfront notification is always best.
Our products like that.
That covers it. Yep.
Okay.
And now the next is you recommended naming your competition in the specification. How do you view organization specifications that list members of that organization? For example, the National Terrazzo and Mosaic Association specification that calls for NTMA members rather than listing specific manufacturers.
I've never used one of those, so I would be kind of guessing here. Louis or David, have you ever had occasion to use this? I know that the NTMA spec is out there, and there are other examples of industry-developed specifications like that. I imagine SDI is not too far off of that, where organization that just did that, and frankly, there is a question, of course, whether the industry organization is, qualifies their membership, or whether anybody can get into it. Like that questionable organization CSI, where anybody in the industry can join. You've got to watch those guys.
You don't even have to own a pickup truck.
No, you don't. So
hey,
I don't
watch
have a
that
good
flight
answer,
of
John,
pickup trucks.
to that. I guess the question, with Terrazzo, if it's a very critical installation, you may want to qualify fabricators very carefully on the basis of their or installers on the basis of evaluating previous work or something. So, but for a less critical project, you might be able to say, hey, as long as you're a member of this, you're fine. I guess thinking of this, the one that I do is I do refer to participants in the AWI quality program, and generally I try to close a specification to those who participate in that program. Now, you don't have to be a member of AWI to participate in that program, but I think their fee structure is such that it probably requires that. And sometimes we get objections to that.
Right, Phil, you mentioned one, SDI, Steel Door Institute, and that is one that I would use, because I do know that SDI has, like AWI, they have a quality program so that their members are required to submit materials for testing. I believe it's annually. Plus they have, and it's tested against the SDI standards. So by referencing SDI as a member organization and requiring the supplier to be a member of that organization, you have some greater level of insurance that the product that you're getting is actually going to meet or be capable of meeting the specification.
Good answers.
So I think if the manufacturer or if the trade association has that QA type program involved, I think referencing them is probably a great idea.
Yeah, good.
Were there any more, Rob?
There's one more. That last question was from John Latin, so thank you, John. The next is from Craig Mount, and he states that when I used to send specs to manufacturers for review, I always stamped them preliminary, not for bid. This provides a little better protection of misunderstandings.
Always a good idea.
Or at least to put a date on them.
Yeah, anything that's headed out to the door before the bid set ought to have that on it.
I actually, for many years, had two different style templates. In my draft template, for example, was a courier type and just looked completely different from my final finished specs. And I put, big draft sign in the header and footer, so it showed up on every page.
Oh,
all right.
Sorry, we do have one more comment.
One more? Okay.
Yep. And he says, regarding associations, the Maple Flooring Manufacturers Association has a set of standards that approved manufacturers and installers follow. So.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to this QA issue, that if that is a QA program, I think that that's perfectly acceptable.
Yes, and there's a difference between, of course, associations that produce manufacturing standards that are used as reference standards versus the ones where membership in the organization is used as some sort of qualification for the actual manufacturer. Well, let's go ahead with the next slide there, Phil.
Okay.
Let's talk about materials.
Okay. Yeah, we shrink that down a little bit. And again, this article is really for primary materials and the standards of those primary materials, which are then frequently are being incorporated into manufactured products. And they're worth eyeballing to make sure, number one, that they're up to date, as these things change. You can drop over to ASTM.org and use the standards search function on their website to double check on standards, and as time goes on I tend to do a little more of that. Are material sustainability characteristics appropriate to the project? In manufacturer's guide specs, the answer to this is probably typically no. They're likely to be not understood well, and so not expressed properly, or out of date. So you do have to watch how sustainability characteristics and in particular lead requirements are represented in guide specs, not only under the material article but throughout the specification. There's no substitute for having a handle on those issues, the lead issues. Fabrication issues mistakenly under materials, well, that kind of thing just happens. I'm not worried about that so much. Accessories. You find that manufacturers have an annoying tendency to enter their trade name products as accessories without really sure. You know, let's say that the work result is a underslab vapor retarder sheet, and they will name their proprietary product for the tape that's going on it. Well, you don't care. What you really care about is that you have a seam tape recommended by the manufacturer, and you could care less what its trade name is. And so I take those things out, and I suggest you do too, and suggest the manufacturer they don't waste your time. The other piece is the more important one, though, and I mentioned it before, that let's take something like a metal wall panel. Unless you're writing real narrow scope sections, the metal wall panel typically is going to have a secondary metal framing article that has the odds and ends of stuff that are likely to be used as part of a complete installation. Some hat channels or Z-metal channels or something. What the British call fixings. And they're typically included in this section. But of course, the metal panel manufacturer doesn't make those. And if you're relying on their section to be complete, you might have to add those here, unless you're going to put them somewhere else, and I'm not sure where you would. On some projects, I've even seen insulation and sheathing put in a metal wall panel section, although those are more typically going to appear, and properly appear elsewhere. But that, it's a good idea to compare the manufacturer's guide spec to a commercial spec master to see what, if you use one, to see if there's some things missing that you need to add.
Okay. This is one of the places where I've noticed that some manufacturer guide specs will say by others, and we need to be careful about that, because in most cases that phrase means not in contract, where the manufacturer simply meant, I'm not providing these, you got to buy them from somebody else. But we have to be careful about how we describe that concept and what language we use.
All right. Louis, so what I would like to do is interrupt here, since we're obviously not going to get through this today. We're nearly out of time. We have one caller that joined us today, Mitch Miller, and I know he had asked me ahead of time if we might ask the group about their attendance at the CSI Academies, if anybody that is called in. I'd like to just take a quick raise your hand poll with the folks that are online with us today to find out how many of you may have been at the CSI Academies last week. Well, we have 3 that I see. Let me just check, make sure that that's it. Oh, no, we have, let's see, 2, 4, 5, I believe. Okay, so what I'd like to do
You mean they
is,
paid to listen to you last week and they came back for more this week, David? I'm impressed.
it's hard to believe, isn't it? What I'd like to do is just ask if you're willing to just chime in with some of your opinions about what was happening at CSI Academies, and we'll just use this maybe as a little bit of input for Mitch for planning for next year's event. So any of you that have your hands raised, if you're willing to chime in, don't put your hands down if you're willing, and we'll ask Rob to go. Mitch, all the hands have gone down. Oh, we have one still left, Stephen Groth. Rob, can you unmute Stephen?
Yep, Stephen, you should be able to speak now.
Are you there, Stephen? He signed in under the computer. He may not have a mic. Okay. We're not going to embarrass you any longer. Mitch, you're going to have to reach out to these folks on your own. So here we are. We're at the end of the hour. As Lewis said, I think we're going to carry this over into next month because it seems to be a really good topic that everyone's interested in. Phil, are you willing to come back and join us again?
I'll check with you on dates. I've got some vacation time planned there, but you know, have lap travel. So we'll talk afterwards.
Okay.
This
Very
is
good.
great fun, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Well,
Okay,
and
glad
thanks
to
to
have you
everyone who asked questions and those who listened quietly, and we look forward to seeing you next month, and we'll try to wrap this thing up then. And if you think of some specific questions that you'd like to ask in advance, feel free to email David or myself, and we'll put our thinking caps on and make sure that those questions get addressed next month.
So thank you very much. Rob, we'll get this notice out as part 2 for for April.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, actually, I do see a couple comments here just before we end. Jonathan Miller writes, and sometimes accessories are options and should be listed as such, pertaining to the conversation we just had there.
You know, that's something you have to be very careful of in manufacturer specs. And Jonathan, I appreciate you pointing that one out. Manufacturers have a difficult time with the concept from the PRM, again, that the specification addresses the contractor. Their experience of specifications is when their installing subcontractor sends them the spec on a project, and so they think of it as a specification that they have to fulfill. And so they get confused about what option means. There are options which the designer chooses, but there are seldom options that the contractor chooses. So we need to have specifiers notes that say, you know, the following paragraph is an option, you know, included if you need it. But you don't want to use the word option within the actual section text, or it means the contractor can decide whether to do it or not. Two very different things. I also see Doug Freeman quoted North Carolina Statute 133-2, which is near and dear to my heart. I used to keep copies of that around and hand it out to folks. I haven't spent any time in jail yet, Doug, but I know that passage well, and it's something that, you know, it certainly expresses the intent of the legislature that they don't want a manufacturer dictating what goes into design professionals' documents on public projects, and it's a good reminder to everybody that some folks are kind of serious about that. I'd never have heard of somebody who affixed their seal to a set of documents only to be to have this question raised. My sense being that if an architect or engineer seals the document, they own that content no matter who wrote it. As a matter of fact, there's a significant body of specifications that are that are written by vendors, and the most frequent one being telecom and data and AV systems.
And hardware.
And hardware, right.
Sure.
And actually formally certain fire protection specifications are written by certified vendors. So, but that's a real interesting piece of North Carolina law. I think there was a clear intent as to why that was done, and if we have manufacturers on board here and they're listening and looking at that, you should be aware of it, and that your input in the specification ultimately has to be clearly understood and absorbed and agreed to by the design professional.
Yep. All right, we are now over our time limit.
Keep those cards and lighters coming in, folks.
Yes, we don't want to take you away from all of the work that we know that you folks are out there producing. So we do appreciate you joining us and hope to see you online with us again next month. And we will invite Phil back, and we'll see if we can coordinate schedules and make that happen. So with that, I guess we'll be signing off, and we'll see you next month. That will be, let's see, I didn't flip the calendar yet, so that will be April 7th, the first Thursday of the month. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. You may now disconnect.